Afternoon. I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of Hudson Institute to what I believe will be a great conversation on a recent book, Friends with Benefits, the US-India Story. I'm Aparna Pande, Director of the Initiative on the Future of India in South Asia. The US-India relationship predates the independence of modern India in 1947. It rests on a strong people-to-people foundation, economic ties, and strategic bonds. The June 2023 official state visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Biden's recent visit to India showcased the close bonds between the two countries. India and the United States share a similar strategic vision, agree on shared threats from China, and are collaborating in defense and technology. They also share similar concerns on issues like terrorism in the region and beyond. However, the book we are discussing today reminds us this was not always the case. India and the US were once, quote unquote, estranged democracies, not, quote unquote, natural allies. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the author of the book and a dear friend, Seema Sirohi, who writes a column on foreign policy and India's place in the world for Economic Times. She has covered India and the United States relations for more than 3 decades for Telegraph, Outlook, First Post, and other outlets. It is also an honor to introduce today's discussant, as he is someone I deeply admire and respect. Dr. Ashley Tellis is the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, specializes in international security, US foreign and defense policy, with a special focus on Asia and the Indian subcontinent. I will request Seema to speak for 15 minutes on her book and provide us with an overview, after which Ashley will offer his thoughts. Seema.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. I want to first thank the Hudson Institute and my friend Aparna Pande. And I'm most delighted and honored that Dr. Ashley Tellis, who is the presiding deity of my book, has found the time to be here. And I'm just thrilled. So I'll tell you a little bit about the book. I've been covering, as Aparna said, this relationship for 30 years. And I've seen it grow from 0 to 100. I think the transformation that we see today deserves the number 100. No other relationship for India has changed so fundamentally as the one with the United States. I felt it was important to document the trajectory, to understand the long distance the two countries have traveled. They've gone from a very scratchy, starchy relationship to what US officials today call the most consequential partnership of the 21st century. How did we get here? What were the difficulties, the challenges, the obsessions, the mythologies, the delusions, and how were they overcome? How did the two countries move from divergence to convergence, from estrangement to engagement? To answer these questions, I've drawn on my reporting over the last 30 years. I try not to lean too much to either side. I have talked to both US and Indian officials. My telling of the story is adamantly non-academic, but always professional, I hope. There's some opinion, a little humor, and plenty of flavor of the times. Rumor has it that the book is a page-turner. It has anecdotes, interviews with officials, and details you may not have read in the New York Times and the Washington Post over the years. Why? Because the Indian point of view is rarely included, and if it is done in a very cursory manner and mostly without the context of history. The book tries to fill the gaps in that story, but I don't take the official view from either side as the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The book starts in the 1980s when I first arrived here, late 80s rather, as a journalist. Things were really different back then. It was like America and India lived on 2 different planets. They barely talked to each other, and there was an air of forced tolerance, I call it. Washington saw India as a giant talking head, always ready to oppose every US initiative. And India was also seen as pro-Soviet. So that's two strikes. The other major US concern was non-proliferation. India had not signed the NPT or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that was a huge problem from the US point of view. In short, India could do no right. As for New Delhi, it saw the US as a country that had sent USS Enterprise to the Bay of Bengal back in 1971 to threaten India during the Bangladesh War of Liberation, and ignored Pakistan Army's horrific conduct, essentially the genocide of Bengali Muslims and Hindus, that's been documented in Gary Bass's excellent book called The Blood Telegram. Why did the US do that? Well, because Pakistan's role in the opening to China was too important for President Nixon and Henry Kissinger. They didn't want to question the Pakistan army. Plus, Nixon and Kissinger seemed to have a visceral dislike of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and of Indians in general. Declassified documents from those times are pretty explicit, and we don't need to go into detail, but Nixon was rather abusive in his language. No surprise then, New Delhi saw US policy as essentially anti-India. Pakistan, on the other hand, was useful for US goals in South Asia. It was willing to do any and everything to accommodate the US, after extracting a good price, of course. Washington winked at Pakistan's nuclear program, ignored its visible hand in terrorist activities in India. The very first chapter of my book kind of describes how things were. The arms manufacturer General Dynamics had a briefing, and they had painted a scenario of India-Pakistan tensions rising, and the US makes an intervention on behalf of Pakistan and against India. And the US neutralizes all of Indian air bases and naval bases and even repair shops. Of course, using the missiles that General Dynamics was selling, the new version of the Tomahawk missiles. So, but that's the way we were back then. Pentagon documents describe India as a hegemon. Today, we cannot imagine that kind of language being used. So my book is basically chronological. It goes through various administrations, starting with George H.W. Bush to the beginning of the Biden administration. If the 1980s were bad, the 1990s were no better. Indian diplomats were in a losing battle. There was no time or hearing for India's security concerns, those emanating from China and Pakistan. Instead, President Bill Clinton wanted India to solve the Kashmir issue. He was egged on by certain State Department officials who tended to repeat Pakistani talking points to push India. After a while, India decided enough is enough. In 1998, it conducted nuclear tests because nobody was listening or taking India's security threats seriously in this town. President Clinton came down like a ton of bricks. He was livid. He imposed stringent sanctions. All scientific collaboration between the two countries was banned. Indian scientists couldn't come here, even for conferences. It was a terrible time. While punishing India, Clinton went out of his way to court China. This is the most interesting thing I find, given what's happening today. He even floated the idea of a G2, where US and China would push India and Pakistan to curtail their nuclear programs. But towards the end of Clinton's second term, things improved, and they've been steadily on the up and up. his clear stand on the 1999 Kargil war was a turning point, in my opinion. Pakistan had violated the border, the line of control between India and Pakistan had come on India's side, and Clinton took a very clear stand and said they had to go back. And so he ended his 2 terms with a fantastically grand visit to India. But along the way, there were lots of twists and turns, which are documented in the book. But it was President George W. Bush who changed the entire paradigm of US-India relations. He came in with the idea that 2 large democracies like India and the US have to get along better. They have to be better friends. And he was also more critical of China. He saw Beijing as a rival. But then came the 9/11 attacks, and once again, Pakistan became crucial for US policy aims and the global war on terrorism. But in the background, India-US relations kept improving slowly and steadily, and finally led to the most important strategic breakthrough, the Civil Nuclear Agreement. One of the architects sitting right next to me, I would say that without the nuclear deal, we may not have had the kind of cooperation we have now. The military exercises, the sale of sophisticated weapons to India, the recent agreement on critical and emerging technologies, the cooperation in space, even an agreement to jointly manufacture jet engines in India. I mean, these are very big deals. You couldn't have imagined them back then. So one can't overstate the importance of the nuclear deal. It broke 30 years of a non-proliferation regime that had prevented closer ties. The Gordian knot was cut. And the Bush administration moved heaven and earth to make it happen against severe domestic and international opposition. More than half this town was against the nuclear deal. And the same in India. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's government almost fell. So the book tries to capture the drama, the nail-biting negotiations, the many attempts by non-proliferation hardliners in Washington to kill the deal, and the many resurrections. It was like a Bollywood movie. The Bush administration also managed to dehyphenate India and Pakistan to a large extent. The 2 countries were no longer spoken in the same breath. And Washington tried to pursue separate policies for India and Pakistan. But the US bureaucracy believed in parity between India and Pakistan. And any gesture towards India required an equal and opposite number for Pakistan. Moving to President Obama, he wasn't that deeply interested in India. He began on the wrong foot. Like President Clinton, he wanted to solve the Kashmir problem. And he also revived the G2 idea, the condominium of US and China to kind of oversee South Asia, something that was anathema to India. But he was mostly focused on Afghanistan war and other trouble spots. India wasn't his priority, except when it came to getting concessions on the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Obama's main legacy is creating a new category for India called a major defense partner to allow for greater cooperation. It's always been hard to fit India in a category in this town. India is not a treaty ally, but it's more than a friend. It's a strategic partner of consequence today. So a new category was created. Obama also saw a dramatic dip in relations after an Indian diplomat was strip searched in New York in a case filed by her housekeeper. The White House and the State Department seem uninterested in resolving the matter quickly. After some tough months, the 2 sides managed to bring everything to an even keel. The relationship kept improving during President Donald Trump's time, despite his rather disruptive ways. Unlike the Europeans, the Indian Foreign Office decided it didn't have the need to criticize Trump every time he said something outrageous. They just kept their cool. And I think Indian and US diplomats deserve a lot of credit for what I call stealth diplomacy. They kept working behind the scenes. Not everything went to Trump's table. Things kept happening. Things kept improving. US decided to sell armed drones to India, a permission that was not given by President Obama. He had rejected the idea. Beginning of a real Indo-Pacific strategy during Trump's time, and the rejuvenation of the Quad, and recognizing China for what it is, a real rival for the US, and of course, a huge problem for India. President Biden has taken all these policies forward. He's in fact run with them. The trajectory is positive, and I expect it'll remain so. Thank you. I hope I didn't
You could. Thank you. Dr. Tellis.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Aparna and Seema, for first inviting me to speak and comment on Seema's book, for your embarrassingly generous introduction. I'll have to live that down in some ways. I want to say a few things about the book, in particular, from an academic perspective. This is a book which has incredible stories and is worth reading because I think it's the only book that I have read that looks at this 30-odd year period that doesn't just give you a narrative about the events, though there is a substantial narrative, but actually captures the zeitgeist of particular moments and does it in a very vivid way. So the rumors about it being a page turner are absolutely true. It's a very easy read, and sometimes when it's an easy read, you sort of fail to notice the subtexts that are present in the typefaces on the page. And so even though you can read it easily, it's worth a certain amount of reflection and thinking about, what is Seema really trying to say in the narrative that she conveys. But I would really recommend that you look at the book because it covers a very vast period of time, but it covers a vast period of time that was enormously consequential. Consequential, of course, for the United States and for India. And I think there are very few transformative moments that we are privileged to witness of this sort when you think about the evolution of history. I think in many ways, what happened in the US-India relationship since the early 90s parallels what happened in the US-China relationship from the 70s onwards. I mean, they are two parallels of truly epical proportions. And I don't mean that just as hyperbole. I think that is a justifiable comparison. And there are elements of that which are important to recognize because they're not parallels simply about form. They're not parallels simply about a president making epical decisions that have consequences. They are also epical in terms of substance. The US-China relationship had real strategic consequences for India. And there is a gentle irony to the fact that the transformation of the US-India relationship is now also going to have very serious consequences for China. It's something that Beijing is actually digesting as we speak, and managing Beijing's response to this growing partnership between the United States and India is something that all three capitals are going to have to work through in the years and the decades ahead. And I have always had the prejudiced view that the spike in tensions that we have seen on the Sino-Indian border in the last few years is in many ways a direct reaction to the perception in Beijing that India has ceased to be the non-aligned power it was of yesteryears and is increasingly gravitating toward the United States to China's disadvantage. And this reaction that we have seen on the border is reflective of a Chinese anxiety, if not a Chinese animus, towards the shifts that have taken place in US-India relations. This is what folks in Washington and in New Delhi, this is going to be the playing field for policy making in the years to come. But I leave that for future histories to be written. I want to just sort of pull back and say some things about the book itself. As I said, the book is a fabulous read because of the way it is written. And sometimes I regret that in my own career, I was not a journalist, but ended up being a failed academic. Because failed academics write tedious and boring texts that are read, if you're lucky, by a half dozen people, some of whom are present in the room. But it's never going to be the stuff of bestsellers, right? Whereas the way Seema writes, this is the stuff of which bestsellers are made. Because it does not just convey the substance, but it conveys the substance in a very attractive form that even if you walked off the street and picked up the book, you don't require to have a PhD in political science to appreciate the narrative and the long arc of the transformation. But even as I was reading the book, I was trying to ask myself, what lessons do we draw from this history? And I want to spend a few minutes just teasing that out, partly because, as I said, I am a lapsed academic and I have to think in terms of sort of structural categories. So let me give you my take on what accounted for this transformation in a sort of macroscopic way. Right? There are many details that Seema describes that others are better placed to actually comment on the specifics. I was there for part of this story, not for all of it. But I loved reading the book because it was a wonderful reminder of many things that I had forgotten that had happened over the last 30 years. And you have to, the journalistic record is so important for that reason, because it will be years before proper academic books are written on the subject. It'll be years before the Foreign Relations of the United States volume that looks at this period finally appears. And in the meanwhile, we have to rely on texts like Seema's to sort of remind us of the changes that have taken place. But I want to flag 5 factors that I think came together in really interesting ways to make this change. The first and perhaps most important is that transformative changes like this do not materialize out of thin air. They appear in responses to real structural shifts in the international system. And I think that is the first thing we need to appreciate. That were it not for fundamental structural shifts that took place after 1991, it would have been very hard to engineer the transformation in US-India relations no matter how much we tried. And what were those structural shifts? 91, of course, was the end of the Cold War. It took away the natural animosity that arose between the United States and India because of India's non-alignment policies for a 40-odd year period. And so the end of the Cold War liberated the United States in particular to seek a new relationship. And I remember after 91, President Clinton sort of making the efforts. They were not full-blown efforts, but the effort to think of India as a big emerging market. You remember Secretary Brown, who was Secretary of Commerce at that time. So people were looking for crutches about how you think about this country. The fact that India lost the Soviet Union as a privileged security protector forced India to think about new relationships, and there were new incentives for India to think about the United States in new ways. Of course, the old problems about non-proliferation still remained, but the fact that 1991 was so pivotal on three counts: the end of the Cold War, the demise of the Soviet Union, and of course, the rise of India's own reforms, which allowed the United States then to think of India in new ways. This was no longer a failed socialist economy that was struggling, but a country that had now discovered the magic of the market, and we've seen, the success of the last 30 years. So structural change is something that we need to appreciate, because I think these structural shifts sort of create the enabling environment, which then allows choices to be made that have, huge consequences. The second factor that I think, and Seema brings this out brilliantly in her story, is the presence of bold leaders who see opportunities and then grasp it. And of course, there are many leaders in this narrative, over a 30-year period. But the two leaders that I think were really pivotal to this process were George W. Bush in the United States and Atal Bihari Vajpayee in India. Both of them responded in ways that were transformative but not inevitable. That is, Vajpayee could have chosen a different course. Bush could have chosen a different course. There was nothing that compelled him to do what he did. But the fact that he did what he did ultimately has to be attributed to the uniqueness of personalities and their response to opportunities. And those things come once in a lifetime. There is a lot of luck involved. I mean, you can't presume that just because there are opportunities, statesmen will rise to them. But you're always delightfully surprised when they do. And here we had, I think, two leaders who really created the preconditions. And Vajpayee, I don't think, has received adequate tribute in the public space for triggering the transformation. And we have to see the way the Vajpayee government responded actually to an event that is now lost in the myths of history. And that is the Bush administration's very early decision to pull out of the ABM treaty. I mean, people have even forgot this event. But the way India responded to that decision to pull out of the ABM treaty was really what set the light bulbs off in Washington. Because India, instead of joining the international condemnation of the Bush administration, India and mighty Denmark were the two countries that stood out as saying, well, we ought not to rush to judgment. We ought to sort of do something to understand why Bush did this. And believe me, for a country that was criticizing us for 50-odd years, this was a very pleasant surprise. And it really shifted attitudes in Washington. And I remember at that time, the Deputy Secretary of State, Mr. Armitage, rushing to Delhi and beginning these conversations with this new country whom we were saying, oh my God, it actually is alive and it moves. We need to think about this country now in a new way, right? So Vajpayee really created that environment that allowed Bush to say, okay, my thinking about this country is justified. Let's see how far we can take it. And he creates, of course, a transformative moment with the civil nuclear deal. But I think there are 4 other things that happened which sometimes get submerged because of the excitement of the deal. And I think it's worth remembering what those 4 things are. For the first time, the United States took the view that the growth of Indian power is in US national security interest. I mean, this is a big idea. I mean, prior to that, if you remember, we spent a good many decades trying to figure out how to maintain a strategic balance in South Asia, right? Everything was about maintaining a balance. Now you have the Bush administration basically saying, we really don't care about these balances. We see India's rise as being in our strategic interest. The second big idea was that the United States began to view India not within a South Asian frame of reference, but within a global frame of reference. And that was driven very much by my boss in New Delhi, Bob Blackwell, who, from the moment he got there, basically said, we're never going to build a relationship with India if we think about it simply in a South Asia box. We've got to think about it as a partnership in a global box. And that's something that was sort of sweet music, to the president's ears. The third big idea was the United States broke the hyphenation between India and Pakistan and created a new hyphenation between India and China. That hyphenation has survived to this day. And then the fourth was, of course, the commitment, which was previewed in the next steps in strategic partnership, and then, of course, brought to fruition in the Civil Nuclear Agreement, which is that we're not simply going to talk the talk, we're actually going to walk the walk. And walking the walk meant that we are going to actually assist India in becoming a world power. And we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to do things with India that we had not done before. And the Civil Nuclear Agreement really just opened that door, and we ran with it. So the second factor, I think, was leadership, and you get that story in Seema's book. The third factor was we were both lucky in Washington and in New Delhi that the leaders had really driven subordinates. I mean, there were subordinates who were driven by the idea that they were going to make this relationship work. One of them actually happens to be in the room. He's in the second row here, Don Camp, who was one of our co-conspirators in Washington while I was in Delhi. But the broader point is this. I mean, leaders are consumed by crises at almost every moment of their lives, right? And certainly every moment of their being in office. You have to rely on others to come up with ideas that are interesting, attractive. You have to rely on others to fight the policy fights within the US government. And you've got to be in the US government to appreciate sometimes the viciousness of the policy fights. So when we finally got the civil nuclear deal announced, there were vicious fights both before and after. And so you need people who are willing to sort of make the effort to work the system to provide these ideas. And my boss in Delhi was one of those characters. I mean, to call Bob Blackwell driven and maniacal is not quite to capture the extent of how, fanatical he was about transforming this relationship. He had friends, but he also made many enemies. And part of making this relationship work was to accept the reality that you would be making enemies, because these kinds of changes don't come too easily. We had, of course, a cast of friends here, Richard Haas in the State Department, Ken Juster at Commerce, Condi Rice and Steve Hadley in the NSC, Philip Zellico, and others. And of course, in the bureaucracy out here in SCA, we had folks like Don and others who sort of helped us. But we were lucky too that in India, we had similar partners who could carry the ball forward. And three people in particular always come to mind: Shyam Saran, Shankar Menon, and Subramaniam Jaishankar, who is now the External Affairs Minister, who one day I will write a book, if my mind does not decay in the interim, telling you about the fights that they had in their system to make this work. And I saw some of those at very close quarters. So driven subordinates, the third factor. The fourth factor, and this is touchy today, but has to be mentioned, the character of the partner. India had a reputational bonanza at the time of the Bush administration. India could do no wrong because of the kind of country it was. And I think about the fights that we had on Capitol Hill during the civil nuclear agreement. At the end of the day, I mean, we went to folks who had spent their lives fighting proliferation battles, and for whom this agreement was complete anathema. But at the end of the day, the argument that persuaded them to change their mind was not, all the great defenses that, we were putting up in the administration about how this was a net benefit for proliferation and all this sort of stuff. I mean, we were coming out with all kinds of formulations that were thought were designed to attract votes in the Congress. What captured support at the end of the day was simply India's reputation and the desire that everyone on the Hill had not to run afoul of this country, which was such an attractive partner. And if India loses that attractiveness for whatever reason in the future, these kinds of deals are going to be harder and harder to implement. And it's a cautionary tale, because it tells you how much the convergence in values at the end of the day even overwhelmed our calculations about interests. Because really on interests, it was a 50-50 case. I mean, one could, with all good sense, make the argument that what you are doing with India really threatens 40 years of non-proliferation achievements. And so how do you weigh the cost to non-proliferation versus, the benefits to India? And at the end of the day, that argument was not won on non-proliferation grounds. It was won simply on the grounds that we share values with this country. This is a great country to take risks for. And if India loses that shine, that would be losing something really, really precious. And then last, I would say civil society. It was the first coming out party for Indian Americans who mobilized in ways that made our lives much easier in terms of selling this deal. There was one thing too that was very interesting at that time, which unfortunately is not true about the diaspora today. The diaspora in 2005 was a very united diaspora. You didn't care what the politics of individual Indian Americans was. They came out en masse and canvassed on the Hill, canvassed with the executive branch to get things done. Today, I fear that the cleavages in the diaspora are becoming more and more pronounced, and in years to come may not be as unified as I've seen them in the past. So let me bring my extended commentary to an end by offering a few thoughts about the future. I want to make 3 points. First, I think this relationship is destined to deepen as long as China remains out there as something that both countries will have to manage. So in some sense, success is fated simply because the structural factors will not give us the luxury of pulling apart. That's point number one. There's a caveat though, and the caveat should also remind us about the contingency of that success. Should things happen to China, this relationship could go also in other directions, right? So the structural factors work both ways. Second, we are going to see a deepening of ties, not just at the state-to-state level, which we've already seen, but in years to come between our two societies. I mean, already you see a marriage between American society and Indian society in a way that has been truly productive, quite phenomenal, and will only increase in time. I mean, I see whether it is a question of labor mobility, whether it's a question of technology, and so on and so forth, we are just going to see our societies get even more deeply intertwined. And that will only strengthen the partnership for many, many years to come. Third, we are faced today with a challenge that we cannot simply overlook or wish away. And that is, there will be divergences, sometimes on values and sometimes on interest. And we have to find creative ways of managing those divergences. We cannot push them under the rug. We cannot pretend they don't exist. We have to confront them squarely and work in a spirit of camaraderie to find ways of managing that. So far, we've been lucky that they have not created unbearable consequences for both sides. And I hope that our leadership and the people who have a responsibility for working these issues will continue to maintain their equanimity in years to come, so that we can take this relationship to where the leaders on both sides in the post-war period imagined that we could. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Seema. Thank you, Ashley. I'll use my prerogative and ask maybe a question or two before I throw it open to the audience. Seema, in the preface of your book, and you mentioned this when you first came to Washington, in the eyes of many, India could do no right and Pakistan and China could do no wrong. I think most of us, almost all of us, would agree that is no longer the case when it comes to the relationship with both countries. And I'd like to focus on the Pakistan relationship. US-Pakistan don't have the same relationship they had in the 1980s. However, there are many in India who still remain suspicious of even the limited ties that the US has with Pakistan. In your book, you have often cited how the Pakistan factor influenced US response to India. Could you share a few examples with the audience?
Sure. In those days, I mean, in the 80s and 90s, Pakistan loomed really large in Washington, D.C. It's very hard to imagine those days today because they're almost, an also-ran kind of a player right now. But back then, they had immense influence on Capitol Hill, within the administration, mainly because of the US war in Afghanistan, the covert war, the most overt covert war that the US was fighting against the Soviets at that time. Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, was a conduit through which the CIA was sending weapons and money. The ISI was deciding the winners and losers, etc. So they were like they were very important for US policy. Even Congressman Stephen Solars, the only friend India had those days on Capitol Hill, the only. Even he, in an interview to me, defended the ISI. He said, I mean, this is just too important. It was a national project, and the Americans were just not willing to listen to anything against the ISI or Pakistan. And India had no role in this war. Besides, India hadn't condemned the Soviet invasion, so you can imagine. I mean, we were in the doghouse. Another example was during the senior Bush, President George H.W. Bush, he had to certify every year that Pakistan is not making a nuclear bomb. Only then would the US aid flow to Pakistan. Everybody in this town knew that they were making the bomb. Back in 1983, I think was the first, according to declassified documents, intelligence had come through US intelligence, State Department's own intelligence. They knew they were moving towards making a nuclear weapon. But every year they got a certification, they are not, so that they could get the money and the weapons from the US. Similarly, during President Clinton's time, India was pushed very hard on Kashmir. There was a particular officer in the State Department who became very notorious in India, a lady called Robin Rayful, who questioned the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India. You can imagine all hell broke loose in India. And she kind of was pushing India all the time, pushing all the wrong buttons. And so India was always upset about this. And she was ignoring all the evidence of Pakistani hand in terrorist attacks. The agenda was to keep Pakistan happy and in a cooperative mode. So anything of concern to India was not important. Then on Capitol Hill, the Pakistanis had, they were spending a whole lot of money on their lobbyists. They were very influential. So the Indian embassy and its diplomats were always under pressure. The Indian army was always under criticism for alleged human rights violations in Kashmir. There was a lot of pressure at that time, and so it was always a factor in that sense. Then I'll give you one specific example. In 1993, we had these blasts in Mumbai blasts, in which hundreds died. The detonators came from Pakistan. They were of US origin. The Indian intelligence found this evidence. Prime Minister at that time, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, said that you should share this intelligence with the US. So Indian Intelligence Agency, RANW, shared it with the CIA. The Americans hummed and hawed for a while. Then they gave kind of a non-report report, and the detonator was lost in an accident. It was never returned to India. Why? Because the US intelligence didn't want any clinching evidence in the hands of India. So, things like that happened all the time. I could go on and on.
That's okay.
I
No
think
worries.
that's enough.
Yeah, that's enough. I mean, the rest the audience can read from the book. Ashley, you have written extensively not just on India, but on Pakistan. You have actually watched the changing relationship between the two countries and advised policymakers on the policies to adopt or maybe avoid. So my question to you would be, do you agree with Seema that for the US government, during the 80s and 90s, the policy was Pakistan could do no wrong and India could do no right? Or was the situation more complex and nuanced? And if so, could you enlighten us?
So I think at the level of the headline, I think Seema's judgment is absolutely right. But when we say Pakistan could do no wrong, I don't think it was because we were oblivious to the wrong that Pakistan was doing. One of the challenges that statesmen have is how do you reconcile sometimes evidence that is embarrassing, that subverts the course of your policy, with the exigencies that that policy is supposed to satisfy, right? And Pakistan's behavior with respect to terrorism and Pakistan's behavior with respect to its nuclear program are both great examples of this fact. That there was a recognition that the Pakistanis were playing multiple games, but the importance of Pakistan for what was the US national project at the time was so important that the leaders of the day did not have the luxury of calling Pakistan out as clearly as they might have liked to. I know this because I saw this firsthand when I was in the Bush administration. When we were fighting a war in Afghanistan and we began to get early intelligence about what the Pakistanis were doing with the Taliban. This was long before it became public. And it's not that we didn't know it was happening, but the president had to spend a long time looking at the evidence and taking a deep breath, because he had to make a judgment call about whether to call the Pakistanis out, and if they did, what impact that would have in the war against Al-Qaeda. And it was Pakistan's good fortune that they were in this Goldilocks spot where they could trade the Taliban for Al-Qaeda. And they essentially, the deal they made for themselves was, we'll give the Americans what they want in Al-Qaeda, And in exchange, we will do what we want with the Taliban. And we didn't quite have the diplomatic and political tools to get them to make a clean break. I think we had one opportunity to do that during the India-Pakistan crisis of 2001, 2002. And unfortunately, I think we flubbed that one. But it's easy to say that in hindsight. At that moment, I can fully understand the calculations of US policymakers. So the point I'm making is very simple. There are always dilemmas. And those dilemmas sometimes take you in uncomfortable places.
Thank you. Turning to China. Today the US and India are strategically aligned on the threat from China. However, again, if we look at your book, it shows that the two countries were not always aligned. Can you think of one or two examples where differing views on China caused estrangement between India and the US?
Yes, again, one could go on and on. The US and Indian views on China were very different. The US officials didn't, at least that's how the Indians felt, that the US didn't appreciate that India and China had fought a war in 1962. The defeat India suffered had left a deep scar on Indian psyche, and the long undemarcated border, constant incursions from the Chinese. So India wasn't willing to trust China. They were always suspicious of Chinese intentions. The US didn't appreciate that India felt hemmed in by China on one hand, Pakistan on the other, and China was using Pakistan. It helped augment its nuclear program, sold them delivery systems, M11 missiles, gave them ring magnets, sold them ring magnets for their centrifuges, which the US National Security Agency knew about, even the price that Pakistan paid. Yet no action was taken, no sanctions were put on China or Pakistan. Because during President Bill Clinton's time, there was just such euphoria in this town about China, 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 selling and making money. US corporations were making hand over fist. And they were selling everything legally, sophisticated technology, precision instruments, high performance computers, all of those things that today, I'm sure the US regrets having sold it to them. They helped China build up its precision, better precision in its missiles and everything. So the Chinese even stole the design for the W-88 nuclear warhead design from Los Alamos. Yet President Clinton didn't put sanctions. So there was all this going on, and Indian diplomats were just baffled. They didn't know why the US would do this to a country that was slowly acquiring more and more power, more and more sophistication, would one day rise to be the US rival.
Thank you. Ashley, and before anybody in the audience asks you, I'm going to refer to the piece you wrote earlier this year, but in a slightly different context. You are the co-editor of the annual Strategic Asia volumes. You write extensively on China and on Asia and on strategy. And in your comments, you refer to India, US, and that success is fated because of the way the US-China relationship is moving, or the way, let's say, the way China is moving. In your Foreign Affairs piece, you had discussed that it's a need to be clear-eyed about the India-US relationship. And even in your comments today, you said that, and it's an argument which is interesting. The city normally says that interests, sort of overpower values. And your argument was that values are maybe more important, maybe because the India-US relationship is different. That values you believe are more important for this relationship and for its future. So I guess my question would be, if the trajectory of India-US relationship remains the way it is in the US-China relationship, what would you see as some of the let's say, the challenges that India and US would need to deal with respect to China?
So I think there are several things. First, I want to clarify the argument about the relationship between interests and values. I think interests are fundamental. You cannot walk away from those. Do not think values are a perfect substitute for interests. But a relationship that is based on pure interests has a finite shelf life because the interests are never permanent, right? Yeah. And you can see that very clearly in the context of US-China relations. Seema complains today that we gave the Chinese a pass. Yes, we did. But we gave them a pass because at that point, our interests were convergent. Yeah. We can, in hindsight, quibble about whether that was an appropriate understanding of our interests. But because our interests were seen to be convergent, we did a lot of things that we otherwise might not have done. My interest is in protecting the US-India relationship beyond the point where interests might compel us to take a different turn. And the only way you do that is by building a solid foundation on values. This doesn't mean that you are oblivious to the issues of interests, but you cannot count on interests alone to carry you over the long haul. And to me, I draw this lesson only because I lived through the debates on the civil nuclear agreement. And at the end of the day, no matter how persuasively we made the argument about interests, they never quite resonated. You know, if you study the philosophy of religion, there is an argument, there's many arguments about the existence of God, right? And one of the arguments one of the proofs that was offered for the existence of God was something called the ontological argument. It was St. Anselm who provided that. And the ontological argument is a very clever argument for the existence of God. And you walk through his argumentation, and there is a part of you at the end of the day that is very persuaded by it, but the heart is never satisfied that it persuades you. And it was the same when we were thinking of interests in US-India relations. Everyone understood the arguments from interests, but it never moved them to vote the way we wanted. But the thing that moved them to vote the way we wanted was the fact that India was a liberal democracy. India was this great experiment in the third world, which is a beacon for the rest of the world. And everyone's saying, we want to be a friend to a country like that. And that's what carried the day. So to my mind, you can't forget the interests. The interests get you a good bit of the way there, but they cannot assure the permanence of the partnership. You need something more. And this is what we have learned in our relationship with our European allies, with our Asian allies, and so on and so forth. As we look to the future, we're going to have to learn one simple fact about India, that it is a country that is big and it has its own sense of destiny. And if you ever forget that, then you're setting yourself up for endless grief. So you build a partnership with India, but do not expect that that partnership with India will translate into India becoming your handmaiden on any political issues, which essentially means that you have to reconcile yourself to the fact that on many issues that are important to us, witness Ukraine, India will go its own way, right? And you can hope that India is constantly in your corner, but don't get into this relationship if it is built on the assumption that India will be forever in your corner, because it won't. And so I think there is a certain maturity that we need to have as we think about the relationship with India. And what often worries me about Washington, it's an American failing. And Denny Blair captured it beautifully once when he said, oh, we are Americans. If there's anything worth doing, it's worth overdoing. And that's absolutely true for our relationship with India as well, right? Sometimes we describe our relationship with India in ways that can only be described as giddy. And each administration is competing with its predecessor in coming up with formulations that are even more hyperbolic than the one that went before. And that's fine. I mean, all governments engage in propaganda, right? The trick is not to be swallowing your own propaganda and pretending that the hyperbole is the accurate description of reality, right? And so my caution, and the piece that I wrote was not meant for India because I think the Indians understand their interests far too well. The piece that I wrote was essentially for US policymakers, which is a reminder that even as we build a very strong partnership with India, on many issues, India will go its own way. That's its right. And we have to live with the fact that there will be times where we will have differences. And so I see challenges that we will have to manage on 2 or 3 big issues. First, the future of the global order. This is an area where India and the US have very different views. We will have differences on the whole question of values. We already see this in our debates every day. And we will have differences on issues of the global economy. And how do we want global economic institutions to reflect our interests, right? But this doesn't mean that just because we have differences, we end up sort of throwing stones at each other. I mean, there are ways in which we can manage this. We've shown that in the past. And I hope we will remain successful at this in the future.
Thank you. Now open it up for questions. So if you could raise your hand, please, a question ends in a question mark. If you have any comments, you are welcome to email them to Ashley, since Ashley is not on social media, I think deliberately.
Absolutely. It's a recipe for keeping one's sanity.
Alan.
Thanks. Thank you, Aparna and Seema and Ashley, for great remarks, fascinating conversation. I'm Alan Kronstadt, Congressional Research Service. I wanted to ask a question that launches off of something you just said just now, Ashley, about on Capitol Hill presenting a kind of potential benefits, or you said the potential cost to the non-proliferation regime against the potential benefits to India. And I think it's those last 2 words that I want to use, because I was also on the Hill from 05 to 08. I'm heartened to hear that at your level, high level of meetings, that there was a persuasive argument to be made. But, I was kind of down with the hoi polloi more, who don't necessarily grasp these kind of arguments that are very clear for IR types or informed policy community. So I recall at the time, for instance, that the US IBC president, Ron Summers, was kind of on the Hill every week and telling anyone who would listen about the hundreds of thousands of jobs that would come from civil nuclear commerce, the profits that would come to US suppliers. There was also at the time talk of a 123 for 126, that India was searching for 126. So a lot of members of Congress who aren't informed about this kind of level of interest analysis would say, hey, they didn't buy the planes. We didn't get civil nuclear commerce. Fast forward to 2022, there were folks on the Hill who reached out. Hey, we've been making nice with India for 20 years or so. How can they abstain on these votes on the invasion of Ukraine and maintain a kind of almost militant neutrality? So I guess my question is mainly to Seema, but anyone who wants to comment, it may be helping me to do my job, because I get inquiries from Congress about, like, okay, 20 years later, what has the United States gotten? And they're obviously asking in more material, transactional terms. So what would be your response to that?
You've gotten India's trust. I mean, just imagine if there hadn't been a nuclear deal. The two countries today are doing so many things they would never have done. So yes, India didn't buy a nuclear reactor from the US, and there are many, many reasons for it, very complicated reasons. But in terms of pure transactional stuff like 123 for 126, like buying 126 planes, India has bought $20 billion worth of American equipment. But I think where I disagree with this whole premise that there should have been some very transactional stuff, no, I think the basic thing was political, that to create a kind of groundwork of trust where the two sides could at least intelligently talk to each other, which they hadn't done for years.
I concur with that argument fundamentally, because for us it was proof that we were willing to make a costly investment to us. And that's really what opened the doors at the Indian end with respect to trust. But having said that, right, I think what India has to do better is to recognize that there are constituencies that have to be satiated, that you simply cannot expect that everyone is going to take the high road and say, oh, we now enjoy India's trust, you should be gratified, thank you very much. So I think India has to do a better job of trying to figure out how best to do that. And in some ways it has begun to, right? I mean, so we've taken already the early steps in terms of India's defense diversification. I would like to see us bring to conclusion some of the agreements about the purchase of reactors. This administration has signaled that it's very interested in bringing that to closure. You already saw that in the joint statement between the Prime Minister and the President when the Prime Minister came here. So it's the opening of a door, and I hope we will just keep pushing on it. But I hear you, Alan, and I think it's probably even stronger a sentiment among elected representatives who do want to see a much greater payoff in material terms from this relationship. I think that's a very real expectation, and we have to find ways to satisfy it.
They should be told to focus on values.
You may not like the answers you get.
Not like the answer you get. Questions? Right up front. Don.
Thanks. I'm Donald Camp. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. And first off, thank you, Ashley, for the overly kind words. It's an honor to be a co-conspirator. I have one quibble to raise and then one quick question. Both of you mentioned George Bush as crucial to the building of the relationship. First of all, well, and you also mentioned Bill Clinton, who started it all, I think, with his trip in 2000. Neither of you mentioned, or you mentioned peripherally, Condi Rice. She was not just a supporting actor. And in my mind, she was kind of the driving force. I have no idea what George W. Bush actually thought about the great powers of the world, but I know what Condi, she wrote a famous article about it in Foreign Affairs. She pushed the nuclear agreement like no one else. She pushed the bureaucracy. She negotiated with the Indians at the last. I really think that she is the crucial figure in the Bush administration, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. The question is unrelated, which is I haven't yet gotten to the portion of the book on the United Nations, but part of India's sense of destiny that you mentioned is that it deserves to be at the high table of global diplomacy, which in the current role is the Security Council. The US has moved in recent administrations toward acknowledging that that makes sense, but there's no immediate prospect of enlarging the Security Council at the moment. And so what I'd like to ask is, how is India going to deal with that? Is it going to live with the current post-war structure of the foreign policy establishment, or is it going to try and break out and create new institutions like China is trying to do? Thanks.
Well, I mean, let me start by just saying that that Condi was pivotal. There's no doubt in my mind about that. Because I saw right from the time that we were in Delhi all the way to the end, both when she was National Security Advisor and then even more so as Secretary of State, that she was singularly our champion. Even when we had fights within the State Department, at the end of the day, it was Condi who took the call that allowed us to close on many tricky issues in the negotiations, which we would not have done because the internal politics in the State Department would not have allowed us to come to that point. So Condi and Steve in the White House were pivotal throughout this process. And when I was in Delhi, they certainly provided top cover for a lot of things that Bob was doing. And you know the inside story on this just as well as I do. So no dissent on that note at all.
And she appears a lot in the book also. I mean, I give her lots of credit. She's the one who wears the boots in the room. Yes.
Absolutely. I used to always think of Condi as, sort of an iron fist in a velvet glove, because she could be tough as nails, and she would listen to all the debates that came to her. And with the most extraordinary charm, she would take sides. She would make choices. And those choices left some winners and some losers. But because she did it with such grace, even the losers walked away from the table saying, okay, we'll come back another day, right? There's life ahead. On the larger question you asked about the UN Security Council, I think India is utterly realistic about the prospects for UNSC enlargement. They recognize that this is not a decision that depends on them. It's a decision that involves essentially the great powers. And the great powers have to reach a consensus. I don't want to be the US representative negotiating that consensus, because this is a problem that is almost destined for failure. When do you get fundamental changes of this kind? I don't think you get those changes outside of crises. And I think we can have many rounds of UNSC enlargement conversations. We will have many rounds of UNSC enlargement conversations. The outcomes will be completely desultory. It's only when there is a crisis that forces the system to respond that we will get that change. Now, hopefully the crisis will not be catastrophic, but I don't see any compulsion to change the current structure outside of a crisis that forces the international community to act. And I think the Indians are smart enough to recognize that it's not going to happen simply as a matter of pure evolution.
And they raise the point in every speech, but I don't think they seriously expect any results. They're putting more focus on G20 and other good things.
Akshat.
Hi, this is Akshat Chaturvedi. I'm an international development professional. My question is related to the international development investment. American foreign policy is integral part. Recently, we are seeing India and America coming together through World Bank and other multilateral institutions to address a lot of contemporary world's problem, namely challenges with financial inclusion in Africa and all. How do you see this route where India getting more and more prominence through American helping hand will actually answer some of those questions which are being asked, that what America and India are gaining out of this?
I would just like to make one point. I think India as the voice of the global South is extremely useful for American goals, because over decades, the US has kind of lost traction in many of those countries. And India, after kind of in the early years of the Modi government, having jettisoned non-alignment, has reimagined it as the global south and is going hammer and tongs on that. So I think that's where US and India come together very well and work together in poorer countries, developing countries.
So I would just commend what happened in the recent IMF discussions, right? If you look at the position India has taken, it has been in very strong support of the US position. What is the US position? The US position has been, we do need to plus up the capital base of multilateral development banks. And because the plussing up will require greater national contributions, it has an impact on voting rights. What the Chinese have done is to say, yes, we like the plus up, but we also want the plus up to immediately translate into an adjustment in voting shares. Now, that's a recipe for paralysis because there is no consensus internationally on how to adjust voting shares. India has taken a very clever position. India has said the crisis of the moment demands a plus up in the capital base. Of course, we would like to see an adjustment of voting shares, but we are not going to make the plus up in the capital base hostage to the resolution of the issue of voting shares. And so India has actually taken a tactically sound position in support of a US initiative. And I see this as being a very hopeful moment for the kind of cooperation that we can see going forward.
Kapil Sharma. I really liked your mention of the diaspora, even though briefly. And if I had one thing that I wish you would gone more depth, and I'm going to ask a question related to that, was that in the 80s and early 90s, while administrations were trying to figure out how to work with India, the diaspora actually kept focus in Congress specifically and with governors on having a strong relationship with India. And Seema, I think you can give more credit also to your profession, the media, because I think about when I was working on Capitol Hill, the role India Abroad played in keeping members in a positive view of India, whereas when you would see the New York Times, Washington Post, any story that covered India generally was about poverty, race riots, religion, and it was shaping the way that thought leaders here would think of India. It contributed significantly. And it wasn't until there were alternative viewpoints that were being brought by the media, Indian media, and diaspora, that it brought some balance, and then we got things like the India Caucus and others. And that really did keep the relationship going like this. But Ashley, you touched upon it, and I want you and Seema to talk about this. The diaspora is now going like this when it comes in thinking about India, right? When the Trump Modi in Texas, how many Democrats did not come to see Prime Minister because of politics? We have more and more diaspora members coming out being critical of India, which is influencing the way that the Hill is looking at India. You have diaspora members of Congress who are also quite critical of the relationship. So I wonder, is the bilateral strong enough to deal with a divided diaspora, which won't maybe not support a lot of the administration's policies towards the country?
Right now, the administration's policy towards India, I think, will prevail. But you're exactly right to mention the divisions that are occurring in the diaspora. It's the most unfortunate development, I think, where, as Ashley mentioned, during the nuclear deal days, during the negotiation, everyone came together. Today, you cannot hope for that at all. Indian American Muslims are on one end of the spectrum, Hindus are at the other, and this division is going to make, firstly, the task of Indian diplomacy enormously more difficult, and if there was a crisis, then, there'll be battles on Capitol Hill. I would not like to go back to the late 80s and 90s when the Indian embassy was fully employed in just fighting those battles the whole time, where the, Pakistani American lobbyists and Khalistani lobbyists were ruling the roost. and members were very influenced by all that information. But I think we are at a very touchy moment, I would say.
I mean, I am not the best person to address this because I don't follow diaspora politics closely. My colleague Milan Vaishnav is really sort of the guru on this. But there are two or three things that I think are interesting to me and troublesome. One is the divisions in the diaspora now have become deeply partisan. So it's not just simply a division, right? I mean, we can have different opinions, but these differences in opinions almost neatly match the polarization in India and the polarization in the United States. And that, to my mind, is not a good recipe for success going forward. Two, the White House is already beginning, and I shouldn't say the White House, the US government is already beginning to feel the tugs between different sections of the diaspora, right? And Kapil, you know this better than most. In the run-up to the Prime Minister's visit to the US, you had different factions in the diaspora arguing for different agendas that the president was supposed to pursue. And again, the tugs, pulls and tugs have become very profound. A third point I would make is that there is also a generational divide now within the diaspora. And the kind of diaspora activism you see is still the diaspora generation that came to the US very recently. But the diaspora has generations yet to come, right? There are going to be our children and their children who don't have the kind of relationship with India that I have had because of birth and migration. And when I see the younger elements of the diaspora, I mean, to be very candid, they're not exactly attracted by what is happening in India. And so if you want to be able to sustain the diaspora being productive partners in the strengthening of the relationship, you're simply going to have to deal with the fact that there is a younger generation which is much more liberal, which does not have an intuitive connection to India in a way that those of us who sort of just came off the boat, have. And I don't know what the future of this, what the future of those generational changes are going to be.
We are running out of time, so I'm going to allow a final round of 2 questions. The lady up front, and then the lady here. So, yeah, one of you.
Thank you. Dr. Mert Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. My perspective is a little different because I stem from the UK. So I'm sitting and I'm listening to all of this, and I wonder, did the US never think to use the UK-India relationship as a case study for the success of India? Someone that grew up in Birmingham, it's like, it's a no-brainer, really. And now when we have our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, it just elevates the prominence and the prestige and the brilliance of India. I fail to understand.
I have a different perspective on that too.
I do too.
Yeah, I think all 3 of us have a slightly different perspective.
Well, let me put it this way. It's not, first, the US and the UK have a very close relationship on a whole range of issues. And when we were faced with the India-Pakistan crisis in 2001, 2002, the US and UK cooperated in ways that are going to be very hard to appreciate from the outside. So we do. But I'm not sure it is in American national interest to make the UK the channel through which we conduct our relationship with India. Because the UK and India have a very complicated relationship. And for the moment, it's on the up and up because Rishi Sunak is obviously a source of pride to many Indians in the UK and in India. But that has not always been the case. And I think from a US national interest perspective, I think we have enough instruments to be able to deal with India independently of any other third country. And I think it's just wise that we stick to those.
I would agree entirely. And if you go back in history, there's just too much baggage coming down from there, where the Brits told the Americans, I mean, the Americans told the Brits to give India freedom earlier, and Churchill said, no way. And also in the recent times, I think the point of view in India is that British Foreign Office pursues a very complicated Pakistan policy, which India doesn't quite like. I mean, in Washington, you can at least understand America is fighting this war, and so therefore, but in the UK, it's so messed up with their domestic politics that Indians don't actually trust the British on those. So I think it's best if the Americans conducted their own policy with India.
Final question.
Yes.
I think it's on.
It's on.
So thank you so much for this very enlightening talk and discussion. You've touched upon so many aspects of the US-India relations and the parts of history, which we have lived, both my husband and myself, for 40 years in the United States. From the time when we came to the United States, it was, do you still live on trees? Why do you have clothes and why do you speak English? To the time now we have new India and India rising and shining. Now my question is a little separate from what you discussed. It's about the G20 that India hosted last month. How do you think that conference would take their India shining forward?
I think India proved by convening this whole G20 so successfully that it can bring different parts of the world together, firstly, parts of the world that think very differently. It became the voice of the global south pretty much in this, and did a very good job. It's another matter that all of the city of Delhi was shut down for the other people. And that said, I think India is trying to be a bigger voice, and the Americans want India to be a louder voice in this grouping. Because again, it partly reflects the rivalry between US and China and India's threat perception vis-a-vis China, because China is trying to take over other groupings in which India is a member. So G20 has become this test where the West is invested in India's success, I would say.
I think what the G20 showed, first, it was a spectacular achievement for the Prime Minister. There's no question. And his fingerprints were all over the year-long process. He democratized foreign policy in a really remarkable way, that the average Indian, for the first time, encountered what its government was doing on the global stage, right? That is quite an achievement, and I think it is truly a tribute to the political genius of the Prime Minister. But we have to be careful to recognize that the hard realities of international politics still survive even India's success in the G20. So the success was that you could actually get people to a common platform and release a joint statement that everyone could agree to. But when you look at the joint statement, there were many issues that were glossed over, because if they did not gloss over, the divisions in that community would have been very pronounced. And so at the end of the day, to my mind, what the G20 reminds me of is it was a great example of what successful diplomacy can do, but it's also a great example of the limits of diplomacy. That you can walk out of the room after all is said and done and still have to face the fact that the nasty world that's out there is still out there. and that all the statements that you generated objectively did not change that reality. And so, do we wish India well? Of course we did. In fact, the US went out of its way to make this a success for India. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that this has been transformative in some fundamental way with respect to global outcomes, right? The proof of that pudding still awaits. And we have to see now what comes out of this process. So in that sense, this was just a waypoint. Let's see what it yields.
It was a very good first step, I would say.
I think so. I think so. And it was India's coming out moment, that it could show that it could host something with 20 countries with radically different views and still have people in the room walk away without killing one another.
And managed to get a declaration
Absolutely.
at the end, and add an entire continent actually.
Yep.
So G21, I presume now. But sort of your remarks sort of echo what I thought is, for all the talk of a multipolar world order, which is always been India's desire since 1947, we still live in a, semi-unipolar, not yet bipolar world order where hard power matters, which means military and economic power, which at the end of the day, there are very few countries who were there who have it and who will determine what happens moving forward. I'd like to thank both Seema and Ashley for the excellent conversation and all of you for coming today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.